Hello, and welcome to today's Jewish Policies webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. You know how often I say to you here and on our X postings, if you want expert information, ask an expert. This is especially true in understanding war and the laws of war. So our guest today is Professor Brian Cox, an adjunct professor at Cornell Law School and a 22-year veteran of the U.S. Army. But before we get to Professor Cox, you know it, your JPC commercial. The Jewish Policy Center was established in 1985 as a nonprofit organization providing analysis of defense and foreign policy. We support strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. Most important these days, we support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And since October 7th, we support the efforts of the government of Israel and the IDF to defend the people of Israel in its borders and, when necessary, beyond those borders. And we support justice in Gaza. But justice means justice for Israel as well, which has lived with threats on its borders and beyond its borders since its establishment. And now justice means not allowing Israel to be slandered with accusations of disproportionate force, genocide, and famine. Justice means knowing the law and applying it. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC also advocates domestically for free trade, small government, low taxes, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as, importantly, free speech and intellectual diversity. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org, spell it out. There you can read our Insight articles, our In Focus magazine, and the winter issue of In Focus is up right now, by the way. It's the beginning of the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. You can find our In Context blog, and you can find our previous webinar programs. Have a glass of wine in the evening, have a cup of coffee in the morning. It's good binge watching. And now our guest, Professor Brian Cox, is an adjunct professor at Cornell University Law School, and a great writer, by the way. You can follow him on X. And he retired from the U.S. Army after 22 years of service. His work is focused on the related fields of international criminal law, the law involving armed conflict, national security law, and comparative military justice. This is enough to fill our cup. While in the military, Professor Cox served in a variety of roles, including 7 years as an Army judge advocate. His combat deployments include Iraq and Afghanistan. As a judge advocate, he served as a military prosecutor, federal prosecutor, brigade judge advocate, administrative law attorney, legal assistance attorney, and military magistrate. I don't know why they let him out of the Army. So you can see where we're going here. Israel is accused of the most heinous crimes, genocide. Genocide, defined by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, is the deliberate, systematic destruction or intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, in whole or in part. Coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, relating to the Holocaust in Europe, it includes killing members, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life meant to destroy the group, preventing births, or forcibly transferring children. Can we talk about Russians and Ukrainian and children? No, we're not. I suspect that this audience is clear on that, but it's important to understand the legal underpinnings, and who better to explain those to us than a man who's been both a legal and a military expert. And he has applied these principles across battlefields, including now the battlefield in Gaza. Now, this is the part where I usually say, Brian Cox, the floor is yours. But I want to start you off with a question. I think something that really resonates with our listeners.
Okay.
I've often said that the first casualty of war is truth. And that the immediate mis and disinformation spreads without proof, or with AI-generated pictures and horror and things like blizzards in Gaza where they don't have any.
Yeah.
But you said, and this is really important, you said law is the first casualty. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. And first, thank you very much for the invitation to join you in the JPC. I really look forward to our conversation. This is something that really occurred to me, an observation that occurred to me as I was studying the connection between law and public perception, and how there's this disconnect between the version of the law that we apply in doctrine and military practice and the public's perception of what we're supposed to do, of what the law requires us to do in the military. And there's that distortion, that divergence is created because there's a community of activists, academics, scholars, advocates, NGOs. There's a community of humanitarian actors who engage with international law involving armed conflict in the public setting. And the version of the law that they generate in public discourse is like, and we can talk about specifics, but in general, it doesn't connect with and doesn't align with the doctrinal version of the law that we apply in practice. Now, that dynamic is always there, whether or not there's a conflict. Before there's a conflict, there is this community of practice who is engaging with the law in a way that, and presenting in the public forum a version of the law that doesn't align with what we apply in practice. That always exists. And it exists so that divergence that's there ends up creating a public perception of the law that isn't accurate. And so that exists before a conflict ever occurs, right? And so if we take October 7th as an example, and we can trace back the conflict and various phases of that conflict since before October 7th, the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, and then also the regional conflict. But if we look specifically at October 7th with the terror attacks on that day, and then the full-scale armed conflict that has ensued since then, we can pinpoint a date that conflict started, October 7th. We've seen footage of Hamas invading Israel and committing the atrocities that they did, and the armed conflict that has ensued. We've seen footage of that as well. And so that has a finite start point, October 7th. And the truth has been a casualty since the very beginning of the conflict. My concern is the law has been a casualty since before that conflict came into existence on October 7th, because this community of practice exists, because they are the ones who dominate the forum of public opinion, right? So you don't hear from people like me, at least when I was still in the military, you don't hear from military practitioners much in public discourse, because our job is to advise commanders, advise staffs, train soldiers, do the things that we do to provide military legal advice to a military audience. And so it's not really our job or our role to get thoroughly involved with public discourse, whereas it is the job of the humanitarian community of practice to do that. And so their version of the law, and again, I'm being general right now, we can talk about specifics, but that version of the law that diverges from the version that we apply in practice, that ends up creating law as a casualty. The law is dead, essentially, at least public perception of the law is dead before shots are fired in any given armed conflict. And that dynamic existed for October 7th and the ensuing conflict, just as it did for 9/11, for the conflict in Afghanistan, or February 2022, when Russia did engage in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We can point to specific starting points for conflicts, and the truth dies almost immediately within an armed conflict. But there's a steady environment of a disconnect between public perception and actual law that exists before a conflict ever comes into being.
But there's also something that you could stump right on top of it. One of it is perception. And we can talk about how that works when you see a blown up building.
Yeah.
But UN General Assembly resolutions, for example, or ICJ resolutions, or ICC customary rulings,
Right.
further complicate the problem, because people assume that if the UN said it, it's law, or if the International Court of Justice said it, it's law. And these things are not law. Talk
That's
about
right.
that. Are they just dumping on top of the problem that already exists?
Well, so the UN General Assembly especially. Well, I'll just back up and just say the UN, the United Nations. There are some absolutely virtuous qualities about having this standing forum for every member state, every and then some non-member states, every member state to come together and have a diplomatic forum where they can engage in diplomatic in negotiations or diplomatic exchange without necessarily having to resort to force to pursue their objectives. And so that's the idea of the United Nations. That was the idea of the League of Nations before that. And so there's absolutely some virtue there. But we also have to recognize that just like any other entity, it is an inherently political body. And so there are various interests that are pursued, various agendas that are pursued within the General Assembly, and then also within the Security Council. And one of the agendas is to use not the only agenda, of course, but one of the agendas is to use the General Assembly as a political forum to foment negative perceptions in the public in relation to Israel. And so that agenda gets pursued. It's easier to pursue that agenda in the General Assembly than it is in the Security Council because the General Assembly can pass any resolution. The threshold for passing a resolution in the General Assembly is really low. And so once a resolution is passed, no matter how many countries abstain, no matter how many countries vote in opposition, if the resolution is passed, it now becomes, the UN says such and such. But it's a General Assembly resolution. It has no legal consequence. The General Assembly cannot create international law. They can pass resolutions and they can refer matters to the Security Council. And so there's a steady collection that has accumulated since I'd have to go back and look, but I think it was the early 1970s is the first, maybe late 60s. But very early, since very early, there have been a steady stream of resolutions that have been adopted by the General Assembly. And so those who pursue an agenda, an anti-Israel agenda, can raise up this collection of resolutions and say the United Nations has said such and such, but it's not the United Nations. It's the United Nations General Assembly, and it's just a resolution for the General Assembly. And so it doesn't actually create law, but there is an incentive for those who are pursuing the anti-Israel agenda to create the perception as though the United Nations has said this is law and every country now has to follow this resolution because the United Nations says so, and it's just not the case.
Okay, so that's the low bar. The
Yeah,
next bar is the ICC and the ICJ,
yeah,
which we are not party to those treaties. And I'm going to ask you to go off topic here and not to do Gaza, but to do Venezuela for a second, because that's also important to us as Americans.
right.
And you wrote about the New York Times and the Washington Post quoting people who were
Yeah,
quoting, in quotes, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, and thinking that we should behave a certain way toward narco-terrorists in the Atlantic Ocean because they said, he said,
yeah,
and he was out of sync with the ICC and the ICJ.
yeah,
How does this happen? And then what does that do to us? Because whatever it does to us, it does it to Israel in spades.
right. So
So tell the
that's
story.
this controversy got started from a Washington Post story, if I remember correctly. They were the scoop. They were the ones that really started this,
Okay.
and they essentially, and then of course New York Times built on it and many other media outlets. So they had several sources who reported anonymously to the reporters from the Washington Post, and they said essentially, paraphrasing, of course, they gave commentary not on background. They gave commentary on what they said occurred during the initial boat strike. I can't remember the date of the first one, but the first one that actually happened. So the administration said, we're going to do this. And then they actually did it. And then there were several boat strikes since then. And then this story came out about commentary that was reported to the Washington Post journalists saying these are the conversations that happened behind the scenes. And if you read the Washington Post story with with an adequate degree of media literacy and kind of critical analysis, you can see that no one in this story is providing commentary on this is a quote from what Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said. It said it was basically he was monitoring this operation, and he said to attack the boats basically. But the way that the article was constructed in a way that if people read it in a uh, more permissive, taking kind of a broader approach to what was actually said in the article, taking liberties with it, that you could then say, well, Pete Hegseth told them, no, leave no survivors and attack everyone, even the people who are clinging to the wreckage of the boat and all this. And so, but you have to want to read the article in a certain way or not know any better. Because if you
Both of
take
which tend to be true of.
yeah, I think so. And so these narratives, but the article was written, the way, I mean, I'm a grad student in journalism now, and so I've been studying a bit, trying to learn the profession of the media more kind of from the inside. And I see the way that this story was constructed. It seems like everything is probably true in the story, but the way that the narratives are constructed, it's built in a way that could fuel speculation. And so the speculation, like people who had some sort of political motive, very often kind of an anti-Trump motive. I mean, just to like my sense is that this was picked up on as a political tool to create a controversy to criticize the Trump administration. Is my sense from looking at how this played out. And so for someone who wants to pursue that agenda, they can take the speculation that's there in the Washington Post story and they can treat it as though this is a direct quote from Pete Hegseth. Or more frequently, what they'll do is they'll say, if true, then this is a war crime, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll treat it as though it is true. So they'll get rid of their own caveat and they'll just treat it as though it's true. And so there was a group of several anonymous former military lawyers, U.S. military lawyers, who wrote an open letter who basically did just that. They said, if this is true, then war crime, blah, blah. And then they treated it though as though it were true. And then the New York Times and Washington Post and other media outlets, now they get to report on this source of anonymous former military members who, they get a lot wrong in their open letter, but now reporters have a source that they can say, this open letter written from these former military lawyers makes these claims, and then they can treat the claims as though it's from an actual expert source. And so, like I think it's still my pinned post on X is where I just basically do a critical analysis and say, okay, these are the claims that were made in this open letter. This is what they got wrong.
And so that's also what you do. It's moving it back to Gaza. That's
Yeah,
what you've been doing in Gaza since the Israelis went into Gaza.
right.
People start with this and then they move to something else. And sometimes they throw in some AI generated, blizzards in Gaza.
Yeah.
We could spend our lives doing this. So how did you conclude? I mean, you're not Israeli, you're not living in Israel, you're not part of this conversation, but you're a military person and a lawyer and a person
Yeah.
who understands it. How did you conclude that there was no genocide in Gaza and there was no famine in Gaza? How did you get there?
Yeah, so it's the focus is always has to be intent. Intent is decisive. Intent was decisive in the way that Raphael Lemkin uh, kind of visualized what genocide would be, and then the UN General Assembly met with his formulation, and then they developed what we now refer to as the Genocide Convention that put into international law what the crime of genocide is. And then that was also adopted, slightly modified, but not much, by the Rome Statute in 1998. And so we have a progression from Lemkin's academic suggestions based on his study of the occupation, actual occupation, German occupation of Europe in World War II. So his academic observations, his recommendations for a new crime of genocide, and then the General Assembly picking this up and generating what we now call the Genocide Convention of 1948, and then kind of refreshing that in 1998 for the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Across this entire lineage, the the most important aspect, the decisive aspect of genocide is intent. And you mentioned it before. The intent must be intent to destroy in whole or in part, as such, one of the four specific identity groups listed in Article 1. And so intent, it's not optional. It's not like, there's a lot of destruction, but we're not sure about the intent, but it's still genocide. Like intent is decisive. And it's decisive in part because it's even in a domestic criminal law context, intent is very often very challenging to to specify, to really assess what somebody's intent was. Because it's not usually the case that someone comes out and says, I'm going to go murder this person for this reason, and they say it out loud. Intent can be inferred, like if somebody goes in and robs a bank, they run in with a gun and they shout, "Give me your money," then you can, like, their intent was to go in there and rob the bank. Okay, so it's pretty easy. But intent isn't always easy to clarify, and and this is the really tricky part in this context. It's not always easy to differentiate what somebody's intent is. And so, to be more concrete about it, for the Israeli government, for Netanyahu, and the security cabinet, um, the intent, the expressed intent, has been since the very beginning, and this is a point I make a lot in my commentary. The intent since from the very beginning, all the way until now, like and throughout this entire conflict, the intent has always been the same. The expressed intent has always been consistent. And I'm going to paraphrase, but it's essentially ensure that Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel, and in so doing, they cannot continue to have a governing role in Gaza going forward after the conflict, and then also to repatriate all hostages that were abducted on October 7th. Thankfully, that strategic objective has been met now, but the remaining strategic objective still applies to make sure that Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel. Following the atrocities of October 7th, right? There was always the possibility that Hamas has the capabilities to carry out what it did on October 7th. But then on October 7th, it confirmed not only that it has the capability, but also the will to do what it did, commit the atrocities they did on October 7th. And so from an Israeli government standpoint, the strategic objective is we can no longer allow Hamas to pose a threat to the Israeli homeland from across the border in Gaza. So that's the strategic objective. That is the intent of the conflict. Now, that's the stated intent. To get to genocide, what we would have to do is we'd have to prove, not infer, but prove that the intent is not to destroy Hamas in whole or in part as such, but it is instead to destroy the Palestinian population. So assuming that they qualify for one of the four specified identity groups, which is a controversial subject to begin with, but we'll just assume the International Court of Justice so far in the proceedings, the genocide proceedings that was initiated by South Africa, they have concluded, at least at the advisory opinion stage, that Palestinians do qualify for one of the four, more than one of the four identity characteristics. And so let's just say that that they're right about that, and the Palestinian population does so qualify. Now, the intent of the government must be to destroy this Palestinian population identity group in whole or in part as such, and not Hamas. And so the methodology for these allegations that Israel is responsible for genocide is all it's like clockwork. I mean, it's like a template that they just basically plug and play, those who are advancing this allegation. And so what they do is they'll cherry pick some, like, take out of context, or just like misrepresent altogether, a couple of observations from select political leaders in Israel, and then that becomes the intent. And then they look at the effects of the in the battle space, and they'll say, well, obviously that was their expressed intent, and the effects that we see make it clear that they are carrying out that intent by intending to destroy the Palestinian population, whole or in part, as such. There's a lot of problems with that methodology, but the main problem is the way that Hamas fights. Hamas, and we hear a lot about human shielding, and we could talk about that as a separate subject, but just in general, the way that Hamas fights is that it deliberately hides and fights among the civilian population in Gaza. And so, in order to attack in a specific attack or across the campaign, in order to, so there are a couple options for ending this security threat posed by Hamas. The Israeli government can ask nicely, Hamas, will you please disarm and stop threatening Israel and agree to not have any role in Gaza post-conflict? It would be really nice if you could do that. So that's one option. That's not going to work, right? And we see that now playing out with the way that the conditions-based cessation of hostilities is unfolding in Gaza now. That's not going to work, and so it requires force, armed force. And so if you have an adversary that deliberately hides and fights among the civilian population, directing attacks against that adversary in the civilian population or below the civilian population, as Hamas does in subterranean tunnels, that the observed effects that we see in the battle space will very well may resemble an intent to destroy the Palestinian population, whole or in part, as such. The actual intent expressed is to destroy Hamas. And so the two the two main mistakes that I see in the methodology of those who advance, and there's a lot of people. We could talk about narrative saturation later, the deliberate narrative saturation, but the methodology is fails usually for two primary reasons. One is um, they fail to account for what the actual expressed intent is. If you're going if the intent is decisive and we're trying to decide what the intent of the Israeli government is, then the starting point really needs to be what they say it is. We don't have to end there, but we need to start by saying, start by assessing what do they say their intent is, and then we can assess whether what we see on the battle space is actually consistent with that intent, or instead, if it's to destroy Palestinians, the population whole and part as such. So that's one major issue. The other major issue is so they tend to cherry pick statements from from people, select people in the Israeli government rather than looking at the stated intent as a whole. And then they also tend to cherry pick observations in the battle space. I mean, and I'm not going to go point by point, but just some examples of scenarios that come to mind that demonstrate that the intent is not to destroy the Palestinian civilian population, whole and part as such. So there was an example, the one specific concrete example that comes to mind is there was a underground C2 command and control node that was identified under the European hospital, and it was several months ago now. And so this got major media coverage because Israel attacked the hospital. They didn't really attack the hospital. If you look at the footage that came out, and you have a weaponry background like I do, you can see that they deliberately delayed the IDF deliberately delayed the fuses of these munitions so that the munitions would penetrate through the ground and explode underneath the ground to try to attack the bunkers rather than destroying the hospital. right? Which would be another option. And so if the intent were to destroy the Palestinian population in whole or in part as such, there would be no need to try to use delayed fuses to get down and attack the Hamas bunkers and tunnel system. You could just blow up the hospital. They didn't just blow up the hospital. Not to say the hospitals haven't been damaged, but you have to look at every specific incident to assess, were there mitigation strategies that were implemented? What was the intent? And this is something that those who are advancing the allegation that Israel is responsible for genocide, this is also something that they tend to downplay or ignore or overlook altogether. Is that there is a lot of evidence on the ground in Gaza that Israel is taking measures to mitigate the effects of the conflict on the civilian population. And if that is the case, then their stated intent, their actions support their stated intent of destroying Hamas in whole or in part as such, rather than the imputed intent, which is to destroy the civilian population in whole or in part as such.
Okay, so along with that goes a slightly different claim because it's not attached to the UN or something that they want to attach themselves. And that is they say, well, it's disproportionate. I mean, yes, a
Yeah,
lot of Israelis were killed, yes, but this is disproportionate. Too much damage, too much destruction. Um, Disproportionate has a different meaning, I understand, in military terms.
it
It's not
does.
that if we kill five, you kill five, and then we're even. What's
Yeah.
disproportionate in military terms?
Okay. This has a short answer,
Let's start with that, and then I'm
but
going to ask you to.
okay. So because there's the context matters because we didn't get here by accident.
Mhm.
Um, the actual assessment, so proportionality has come to have two meanings within international law. One is on what's called the use ad bellum, so the resort to force. So a use of force in self-defense has to be proportional. But then the way that most people envision proportionality is in the conduct of hostilities. And so the actual doctrinal definition, which I'll express it almost verbatim, is that an attack is prohibited if the expected incidental damage is going to be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected.
Okay, wait,
Uh,
stop there. Repeat
yeah,
that line. That is to me a
it's
hugely important line.
it's really important. It's also important to focus on the first thing I say because we'll come back to this. But each attack, so this is evaluated based on an attack, and an attack is defined in international law as an act of violence in the offense or defense. And so, in order to doctrinally assess proportionality, we have to assess whether the personnel who are responsible for an attack, we have to have this for each individual act of violence, what their expectation was. And so to find a violation of proportionality, we have to find that they expected incidental damage, that the expected incidental damage was excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage that they anticipated to be gained from the attack, and they attacked anyways. That's proportionality. It very rarely, I mean, to be perfectly blunt about it, proportionality in LOAC, law of armed conflict, is very rarely violated. I can't think in the 7 years that I was a military lawyer and then the 15 years I was a combat soldier before that, I can't think of a single scenario where a commander or someone who was responsible for an attack said, you know what? I expect incidental damage, and that incidental damage is going to be excessive in relation to the concrete direct military advantage that I expect, and I'm going to launch the attack anyways. I mean, it shocks the conscience. I mean, I guess Hamas probably would, but Israel, United States, NATO countries, that's just not how we fight. If the expected incidental damage is going to be excessive, expected incidental damage is going to be excessive in relation to the concrete direct military advantage that we anticipate, we're just not going to launch the attack, and it just makes intuitive sense. Now, in order to evaluate that, though, we have to understand. Well, one, it's by attack, so by every act of violence in offense or defense. But we have to understand what the intent was of the personnel who were responsible. If we don't know, if we don't have evidence to know what their expectation was of incidental damage at the time, And if we don't know what their expected military advantage was at the time, then we don't have enough information to make a proportionality assessment. We just don't, which is inconvenient in the form of public opinion. If I want to form an opinion about what, so this is where public perception deviates quite a bit from doctrinal practice. So if I'm a journalist and I want an attack has happened, I'm going to go to an expert in international law. And I'm going to say, you expert, I'm not an expert in international law. You are. You studied international law. So you tell me what proportionality was and was this attack disproportionate? The problem we have, one of the problems we have is this expert that the media reporter is going to may be an expert in international law in general, but isn't necessarily an expert in applying international law in context in combat, or at least in training for combat. And there's a difference because I can study international law and say, well, the rule is, anticipated incidental damage can't be disproportionate, whatever. But if I'm not assessing doctrinally, like what the rule is in doctrine, and I'm not assessing it in the way that that military that I'm evaluating from the outside is, then I've created a gap between what their obligations are in training and carrying out this attack and then responding to it afterwards. They have one standard, but then another standard altogether happens in public opinion where we tend to paraphrase. So we say something like, "This attack was disproportionate," we can clearly see that because I didn't. And this is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these NGOs. They all take the same methodology, which is not the same as what we do in the military. But they essentially they'll send somebody out to a site that there was an attack. And they'll poke around, they'll ask, like, were there any insurgents in here? They'll look for evidence of military objectives, radio equipment or whatever. They'll look around, they'll ask around, they'll be like, nah, I didn't see anything. There was no evidence at all that there was a military objective here, and so this must have been disproportionate. Well, that's a flawed methodology, right? They are not actually identifying what the intent was of the personnel who were involved. And what they should do then is they should just I'll be more professional about it. They should just refrain from offering an opinion in public if they don't have the evidence that we would require to assess in military practice because we have that evidence. The IDF in this case, the U.S. military, in my experience, we have access to this evidence. We are looking at we have access to the personnel who are involved, who are responsible for the attack. We can go to them afterwards and say, what was your expectation of incidental damage? What was your expected, military advantage? And we can assess that, we can maybe look at the circumstantial evidence to tell if they're lying to us. But our starting point is going to them and saying, well, okay, this incident happened. Did you expect incidental damage? Well, what was that expectation? What was the nature of that expectation? What was the military advantage? Why did you engage in the attack the way that you did? These are the questions we have in the military, we ask in the military when we're evaluating whether an attack complied with LOAC proportionality rule. None of that happens in public discourse.
And it doesn't happen photographically either, because what they show
Yeah,
you is rubble and they say, oh my God, this can't be proportionate.
this is disproportionate. Yeah,
Disproportionate. I mean, it's almost always about rubble or freezing
yeah,
children or whatever, but it opens up the larger issue here. You spend a lot of your time responding to these people on X. I don't know how you do it. I mean, I spend mine too. You
yeah,
use saltier language than we do, but it goes to the question of how do you deal with flood of information or misinformation or
yeah.
disinformation that comes out. The military has all these definitions, and you have better information and you have better understandings, or at least different understandings. There are people who might say your definition is wrong, but never mind. It is the military definition. How do we get the word out there? You just do it all the time. How do you keep doing it? And are there enough of us to keep
I,
doing it?
I don't think there are. I mean, it's on purpose. Like, in the interest of time, we won't go into the specific factions of the agendas that are pushing misinformation, disinformation, but there are several that converge on the conflict in Gaza. Um, the so my I've been interested in this divergence between public perception and military doctrinal practice
Me
since
too.
long before October 7th. But this has been what has happened since then has basically been my worst nightmare because, um, w like before October 7th, say in the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, an incident happens and New York Times or Washington Post or whatever will report on it, and it captures the public's attention for a little bit and then it fades. And then something else will happen, and the public's attention gets focused on international law involving armed conflict and practice, and then it fades again. And so that's difficult to manage, but it's still easier to manage than October 7th and the conflict that has ensued since then, because in that case, you're basically in triage. New York Times published this story, their experts said this is how they got the law wrong, and then everybody moves on. And so in that case, it's more of a triage situation. Here, I mean, you described it, the word you described to use it, I think is pretty accurate as a flood. I don't know how, and this is something I've reflected on a lot. I don't know how you you stop a flood. We're not the people who understand doctrine, who are committed to the truth, who are willing to engage in public discourse in this way. I think we're not organized enough. We're too few and far between. And so we don't have, there's no way to stop the flood unless there is this organization that would come together to take it on in a more systematic manner. Um, but I think the best that can be done is just to, to do it on to engage in a doctrinal analysis or engage in a legitimate analysis as much as you can in order to create something for people to hang on to, right? To say, well, okay, New York Times has said this and people are taking it out of context, but here's this one person at least who challenges that methodology, right? And so I think just keep chipping away at it to create an anchor for other folks who are interested in the truth to grab onto, rather than building a wall against the flood, which would be great, but I think it would take a lot more organization and resources that currently exist than currently
Yeah,
exist.
I think that's true both in the United States and for the Israelis.
Yeah,
They have PR people. You all in the U.S. military have PR people, but somehow it doesn't seem to get to the New York Times and the Washington Post.
right.
Um, so this brings us to this sort of set of where do we go now? I think that in fact the famine thing has been debunked.
Yeah,
Um, there is, how can you have a famine if 52 aid organizations are bringing 200 trucks a day into, okay, so the
yeah.
famine's been debunked. The genocide almost debunked, I think. It's disappearing until somebody said something about Israel had a weapon that vaporized 3,000
I
Palestinian
saw
bodies.
that.
And but you have to count them because they were here before, but they're not here now. So there's no evidence,
Yeah,
but never mind. Um, okay, but it opens a question to future. And I know I'm not going to ask you about the Board of Peace specifically, because, you know, you can tell me why I'm not asking you, but is there something now? Gaza is in a state of flux at the moment. There's a ceasefire.
yeah,
Hamas is taking full advantage of that ceasefire. It is rearming, it is regrouping, it is stealing aid, it is terrorizing the local people. And nobody, and by the way, justice in Gaza means justice for Palestinian people as well, which means taking
totally.
the boot of Hamas off of their necks,
Yeah.
whether they want to or not. You have to. Is there any requirement that the rebuilding process that the Board of Peace is discussing happen before there is a settlement of the conflict? In other words, is there any requirement that you know of in humanitarian law, in military, that once the active shooting is mostly over, you have to go rebuild? Or
Yeah.
is it reasonable to say, no, you can't rebuild. You can take care of people, you can feed people, you can provide medical aid, but the rebuilding can't happen until the war is over. You and I had this conversation about wars being over.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean the future is really, I think there's a lot of challenge, but also opportunity in the future. The conflict that we've seen after October 7th is, I mean, Hamas has been preparing for this for a long time. And so if the future is handled properly, then the it would be Israel's strategic objective would be met, basically. That Hamas, the threat posed by Hamas in Gaza and the region, would be mitigated to the point of non-existence, so that less radical, less fundamentalist factions within Palestine, among Palestinians, can end up taking control. So there's no obligation to rebuild at any time, legal obligation to rebuild at any time, but there's certainly not an obligation, or even it's not a good policy idea to start the rebuilding process before the conflict has been resolved to a point. Because I mean, if we just take like literally a building, and we put in the resources and the effort to start building this structure, and then the conflict isn't over yet, and so it becomes a target or it becomes attacked or whatever. Then we're just waste like all that effort that went into developing that structure is gone. And so the conflict has to be managed to an acceptable level. And the biggest challenge, but also opportunity going forward now, is that managing this conflict isn't going to happen by, you know, well wishes and fairy
For sure.
tales and public sentiment and or even just public investment. Like public investment is important. People are going to, there has to be money to drive this, but there has to be a commitment to use force, armed force if necessary. The IDF has been doing this, but like as the peace plan, it envisions that when the international stabilization force is robust enough, that maintaining the responsibility for maintaining security will be passed over from IDF to the ISF. This is, I think, one of the most fraught. This is one of the areas where there's a pitfall, that like the most likelihood of a pitfall, because the international community is going to have to not only put their money where their mouth is, but they're going to have to put their troops where their mouths are as well, and they're going to have to put their
Definitely.
troops in harm's way, and they're going to essentially going to have the political will to do in Gaza in the fight against Hamas, to the extent that they still exist, the exact same thing that Israel has been doing, fighting Hamas to ensure that it does not pose a security threat in Gaza. That's the stated intent. My assessment is that's been the actual intent. The international community is going to have to step up. Under the Board of Peace, under the peace plan, the ISF, the International Stabilization Force, is going to have to step up, and it's going to have to do it with force of arms if necessary, and have to be prepared to do it with force of arms if necessary, and not just words.
So, as we come to the conclusion of the program, um, regular listeners know I like to go out on a positive note. So I always try to ask a question at the end that elicits a positive answer. But I sort of disagree with your last point. I mean, I agree with the principle of your
Yeah.
last point, but the countries that have agreed to be in the Board of Peace, and even the
Mhm.
countries in the International Stabilization Force, have already said, no,
I know.
no, we're not doing it.
I know.
We're not going to bring our armies. We're not going to,
Yeah.
we're just not going to do it. And then on top of which, Israel responds to daily
Yeah.
breaks in the ceasefire by Hamas, and Israel gets condemned for the ceasefire not holding and all that. So my view of this is extremely negative. Which is what I don't want. So I'm going to ask you,
Yeah.
as I say, thank you for a brilliant exposition of what we should know and why we should know it. Do you think this can work? Do you think there's a future for Gaza unless Israel finishes the job and takes it over?
I mean, I'll say I share your pessimistic outlook on this. I think
Thank you.
as I characterize it, it's challenges and opportunities. The opportunity is there. I think the peace plan, the conditions-based cessation of hostilities, the framework is there. The Board of Peace, the ISF. If this moves from paper into practice, I think this is a generational opportunity. But that is the opportunity here. but it is full of risk. And the risk is that, um, it's just people, the commitment isn't going to be there, the hard commitment to do essentially basically what Israel has taken on to do since October 7th. If that commitment isn't there, I mean, I'll just be frank. My assessment is this won't work. It's just going to be a piece of paper. But uh, I think as long as the administration, because they're the driving force behind this,
For sure.
as long as the administration stays attentive to developments in Gaza and the region, and they stay active on diplomatic pressure, this has a chance of working, of being a generational opportunity to completely change the nature of this conflict that has been dragging out since, the late 1940s, in one way or another. So this is a generational opportunity, but it is going to take commitment. And what remains to be seen right now is that commitment actually going to be there?
Okay, so I'm going to accept that as a half optimistic
Yeah.
response to a question.
Yeah.
I really prefer, 90% or 95%, but I know I'm not
Mhm.
going to get that from you. So instead, let me say, Professor Brian Cox, this has been exhausting,
Mm.
fascinating, and very, very important to us because we see what we see. But the more we know, for anybody who still reads the New York Times, please explain to me why, but other than the entertainment section on Sunday. Um, when you see what you see in the media, you have to know what's underneath it. You have to know
Mm.
the law that's underneath it. You have to know the principles that are underneath it. And by the way, you have to believe, as I do, that there are moral armies in the world and there are terrorist armies in the world. And we live in the United States where happily I believe that ours is among the high points. And I also
Mm.
believe the IDF is among the high points, which is why we advocate coordination and cooperation between the two.
Right.
But you have to know the rules under it. And so for this, I thank you. And to our
That's,
listeners, we'll be back.
all right. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a really fascinating conversation, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Okay. Thank you.